Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to look at a game by Oxfordshire chess legend Ian Bush versus James Longworth. James plays e4, Ian plays pawn d6. Now, as the engine shows, this is not the best move on move 1 by black. There are only two moves that are correct on move 1, and they are pawn e5, which is an excellent move, taking space in the centre and making way for the bishop, and pawn c5, the Sicilian defence, which is also an excellent move. Pawn d6 is suboptimal. The thing is, mathematically, it's not losing. Unlike the Latvian Gambit and the Borg, both of which I used to play and both of which are mathematically losing. It's not losing, therefore you can't say it's wrong. The issue with it is, it blocks in the king's bishop, which we need to develop, to castle. And Ian and other players of the Pirc solve this ingeniously by playing g6 and developing it as a fianchetto. Anyway, those are just my prejudices. So basically, white plays knight c3. Again, not accurate, because as the engine points out, this allows c5 transposing into the Sicilian and e5. But Ian has got a plan in mind, and as discussed, wants to develop that bishop on g7. d4 is a good move. Knight f6 is a good move. Knight f3 is a good move. Bishop g7. Bishop c4 is quite popular in this position. The engine doesn't hate it. I'm not quite so sure. I mean, I don't quite see what the concept is. When white does this, I sometimes play e6 just to protect f7 and claim that that bishop's misplaced. But, there are some concepts you can play as white, like you can play bishop e3, queen d2, f3, then try to play bishop h6, maybe castle long, maybe play h4, h5 and try and checkmate that way. You can play the Austrian attack, f4, and then play for e5, hoping to evict the f6 knight and start a kingside attack. I don't really know what bishop c4 does. I suppose it sort of pins the f-pawn, and often black's activity comes from the f-pawn. So it's not a terrible move. You might think of it as a prophylactic move. Anyway, Ian castles. Oh, one other thing to say as well, by the way, is I was thinking about this, there is an alternative, quite interesting move order, I think, where white's playing bishop c4 earlier, and then bishop here, and then you're playing moves like queen e2, and black plays knight c6, and then it's e5, you take the d-pawn, you sacrifice your queen. White gets a piece, black takes, white gets another piece with the threat of the great big GH equals queen. Black moves the rook, white takes the knight, and then we have a conversation about whether three pieces are worth the queen. So this version of Stockfish is saying white's a little bit better. If you really fire it up in the cloud, it says black's a bit better. It's certainly interesting. So that is a clear idea. But the game as it's played is slightly different because you're developing knight f3. Sort of everyone's developing sensibly. Okay, everyone's developing sensibly. Now my memory is here, white doesn't castle. White plays, that was a variation. So here, we're back to the game. White plays bishop g5, and again, I'm not sure what this is actually doing, what the concept here is. I mean, you can say, well, it develops the bishop, and that's correct. But I'm not sure how it all fits together as an idea. And indeed, it does allow this tactical trick, which the engine likes, where Ian takes here, and then plays d5 and forks the two minor pieces. So here, the engine wants to castle, or play queen e2, or those sort of things. Or bishop b3, again, is a good prophylactic, because it stops this manoeuvre where you take on e4 and then you fork. White's played this. Ian's sensibly taken here, probably after a bit of thought. I mean, I wouldn't just pop it out, because you've got to make sure that white bishop can't escape with check, or you've also got to think about bishop takes f7 check, and then, is that a problem? It's not really a problem, but it's worth considering. Anyway, white takes, Ian plays the fork, bishop takes. Actually, the engine wants to play bishop d3 and give the knight rather than give the bishop, because now black has the two bishops. This looks like a good move, but black's a little bit better here. Queen d6, which is sort of brings to mind the Scandinavian. You've always got the b4 square available when trouble happens. That's the concept in the Scandinavian, and actually it looks a bit like a Scandinavian with that king's head thinker. I'm sure. I hope that's not offensive to Ian. Anyway, I think h3 is a good choice to stop bishop g4, which might put pressure on the d pawn. Ian developed a piece, always a good idea. Now the engine doesn't really like this break. I must admit, I think it seems fine. What does the engine want? c5. Oh yes, c5. The Sicilian. Or queen e6 check, which is not a bad move. It's a bit weird, but it's not a bad move. So the engine doesn't really like this. We get, because what the engine wants to, what? Long castle here. Fine. Fine. So we get an exchange. Queens don't come off, although they could. It's check. Bishop e3 is fine. Bishop e6 is a good idea, anticipating long castling. Long castling happens anyway. The engine points out beautifully, of course, that you can take on a2. And if white takes back with a knight, then queen b2 is mate. I mean, this is the key point, right? Well, it's certainly a point that you can't do that. Well, you can, if you want to go home early. But, so I wonder if Ian thought about bishop takes a2. I'm sure he did. I wonder why I didn't do it. Maybe worried about the bishop getting trapped. You know, only the paranoid survive. So that might have been the worry. I'm sure it'll tell us in the comments, Ian. a3 is a good move. Because, why? Because the pawn on a2 is attacked twice. I would also consider moving the king. But I suppose when you consider moving the king, you've got to consider bishop takes c3, queen takes, and then the queen arriving on a2 is going to be pretty unpleasant. So here, the problem, it wants to play rook a d8 for its own reasons, but I think you've got to look straight at that. I mean, that's enough to stop you doing it. Okay, okay, fine. You know, no human wants to get into that. So a3 is a good move. I'd look at b5. I suppose c6 is aiming for b5. Engine doesn't like this because it can be pinned. Knight defends the pin. Queen could go to d5 but goes here. Queen gets out of the pin. All makes sense. I think Ian's getting the queenside pawns rolling. White exchanges. Black blocks there, and the king's actually very snug there and safe. White irritates the bishop. The bishop moves to a good square that it's hard to evict it from in the short term. Fighting for the open files. All very logical. This isn't great because the alternative was b4, which no human's going to play. I don't think. I wouldn't play that. Or a4. You know, you don't want to move the pawns around your king. On this occasion, the engine can see it all works because probably the queen's there defending and the knight's there defending, but it's not very human. White does something more natural, which is to storm his pawns towards the enemy king rather than storm his pawns away from his own king. This is brave. I think given the queen and rook are facing each other, I think a bit about playing c5, but the engine completely agrees with Ian. Maybe. Well, the engine agrees. So, you know, in the era of engines, it must be right. But my issue is the rook and queen looking at each other. Okay, c5, knight there. Attacks the knight twice, and then rook here is not a good move. Now, how would we guess it's not a good move? Well, white's in a tight spot because if you move the knight, the f2 pawn is dropping. So white's in a tight spot. The engine wants to play knight g5 because the f pawn is pinned. How very amusing. But the issue with this rook is it doesn't have a lot of squares along that rank. And Ian immediately exploits this by pushing the pawn. John D'Souza, when we discussed this, again, another legend who used to coach the county team with me. Well, he was better than me, but we used to coach the county team together. He made the point that white's lucky to get away here without losing a piece, which is absolutely right, because the knight can move and attack the queen, so it becomes complicated. Queen picks up a pawn. The rook escapes and hits the queen. There's a nasty check there, which is a good move. And then Ian chooses to swap the queens and say, I've got a better endgame, and in particular, my pawns on the king's side are strong. I mean, as it happens, white's queenside pawn structure is also damaged, although the knight is nice. That knight on d4 is forever, but the kingside pawns are a problem that needs to be addressed. White moves that lovely knight, although it's the engine move, going after the queenside pawns, looking for counterplay. But the basic problem is just not quick enough. So he's going after the kingside pawns, but at this point, Ian has achieved 2 connected passed pawns on the kingside, which is enough to win in the medium term. But he now realises he can win in the short term by just pushing the h-pawn, because it's got a straight run and it basically can't be stopped. The rook tries to stop it, push, the rook tries to stop it, push. And now we've got this classic problem, which is that rook's coming to g1. And if you play rook h1, it comes to g1 with check. And if you move the king, it comes to g1 anyway and shields the h1 square, and it's defended by the pawn on g1. It's a very common theme. You can do this with queens coming to the final rank, or knights or bishops, but actually rooks are the most common. And so basically it's over, and Ian's opponent recognises that and resigns. So I thought a really good game, really interesting examination of the Pirc Defence, which, as we all know, it's sound, but it's not the best opening. But in a way, it's complicated, right? Because if you're playing an opening that suits your style, you like the positions, you're more familiar than your opponent, it might even annoy your opponent. I mean, the same applies to the Scandinavian defence. Then it's a good opening, and the joy of chess is that there is such a wide choice of moves that are sound and express different ideas. So thanks for sharing, Ian, and I hope you're all well.